Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I compliment the member for Folkestone for getting this debate today and for the way in which he introduced the subject, because it is absolutely crucial and essential to all of our lives that we think very, very seriously about what press freedom actually means. In any free society, the right to know, the right to speak, the right to assemble is a very, very important and precious one. Indeed, is encapsulated in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in considering issues of press freedom, we should also look at questions of media ownership and control, the concentration of media ownership into a small number of global companies that in turn impose news values on their outlets, which are not necessarily very open. They oppose news values, which are often not very interested in many of the poorest parts of the world, but only interested in celebrity and the goings-on in the wealthiest parts of the world. And so I do think it's important that we recognize the importance of the right to know, and therefore the right to have diversity of ownership and diversity of access to the media. As the member for Folkestone quite correctly pointed out, many people now gain most of their information from online sources, from social media and social media outlets. Many people simply do not buy newspapers and do not access newspaper websites or anything else. They rely completely on what they believe to be self-selecting news that they select themselves from various websites around the world. What they're often unaware of is the complicated and very efficient algorithms that are used to drive people in certain directions, in certain stories and certain news issues. And so I do think we have to look not just at freedom of journalists and the importance of independent ownership of all media outlets, but also of the way in which we should all have access to social media. The social media companies have shown themselves to be very happy to operate with authoritarian regimes, with oppressive regimes, and even to close down access altogether to individuals, such as the way in which the Indian farmers, at the midst of their dispute, their strike in Delhi, suddenly found they had no access to social media whatsoever. It was a crucial outlet for them. The way in which it's restricted in a number of countries, and the way in which Google and others are quite happy to do deals with national governments in order to restrict access to their information. So I do think these things have to be looked at very, very seriously and very, very carefully. We need international agreement on this, and I'll come on to that in a moment. I've got in front of me here the white paper on global journalism. The white paper on global journalism, which has been produced by the International Federation of Journalists, of which I am a member, in the sense I'm a member of the NUJ in Britain. And this report makes chilling reading, as the member for Folkestone pointed out. Since 1990, 2,650 journalists have been killed around the world that we know of. There may well be more than that. And a woman who's a good friend of mine, Annabel Hernandez, a Mexican journalist, who launched a book called The Sorrows of Mexico with Lydia Cacho and others at the Edinburgh Book Fair I think 3 years ago, and I was there when she did it. And she described what she had gone through in preparing this book and in writing about the power of drug cartels, of corrupt police forces, of the role of the military and the threats that were made to her. And I just quote a little bit. Ever since I've had to live with 24-hour protection, if you can call that living. The threat never goes away. On the 21st of December 2014, a dozen men armed with AK-47 rifles and handguns closed off the street where Hernandez lived and started asking her neighbors in which house the journalist lived. They deactivated the security cameras in the immediate area, including those installed in her house. She was lucky that day. She wasn't at home. She was away. That is the kind of life that she and other very brave journalists live in Mexico, in Colombia, in Egypt, in other countries where journalists are consistently under threat. Those that are being killed, we mourn. But there are many others who are in jail And the threat of jailing journalists is a form of censorship. And many of the governments of the world know that by consistently threatening journalists, they will tone down their reporting or simply not report what is going on where corruption, drug cartels, and so on are involved. And there is a kind of league table of journalists that are in prison. There's 235 that we know of in prison globally, 67 in Turkey, 21 in Egypt, and 20 in China. And they are all people who've been in prison because they were trying to report on the truth. And the member who introduced this debate quite rightly pointed out what had happened to Roman Protasevich. Obviously, it's appalling that the plane was effectively hijacked. He was taken to Belarus because he'd been writing stories that were critical of the regime in Belarus. And obviously, action should be taken. And I'm a member of the Council of Europe, along with others, and we will be making our views very well known on that at subsequent meetings. Belarus, unfortunately, is not a member of the Council of Europe. It's the only European country that is not. But our complaints and objections about the way he's been treated would be far more credible if at the same time the London Stock Exchange wasn't hosting financial servicing arrangements and opportunities to raise cash for the Belarusian government. And so if we're serious about press freedom and serious about freedoms, we've got to think very carefully about what financial institutions and others do at the present time. The terrible events in Gaza and the West Bank over the last few weeks and the loss of life of people both in Israel and in Palestine is obviously shocking and appalling. But it's also very clear that the bombing was very effectively and efficiently targeted in Gaza. 2 towers were taken out completely. They were demolished by targeted bombing. They included the offices of Al Jazeera and of a number of other journalistic outlets in the region. So they couldn't any longer effectively report what was happening in Gaza. There were some brave journalists who managed to use satellite phones and so on to keep in communication. But they were reporting under fire from Israel that was quite clearly targeting those places where journalists were trying to report the reality of what is going on. And Yusuf Abu Hussein, a young journalist, was also killed during that whole process. And so in today's debate, I hope we can reflect on the bravery of journalists around the world, those that seek to speak truth to power, and those that try to tell us the truth of what is happening around the world. We all love newspapers. We all love news and information, but we need to make sure that those that collect and gather that information, irritating as they often are to politicians, and that's the world in which we live, are a crucial part of any democratic society. And so I think the work that's been done by the International Federation of Journalists and others in trying to get global agreement on the protection of journalists is very important. And it's important that the United Nations Human Rights Council continues its work on protecting journalists, and that we have an effective protection mechanism for journalists all around the world. Too many have died, too many are in prison, and too many are frightened of reporting the news they ought to be reporting because they're scared of what will happen to them if they do so. And we shouldn't be complacent about our own society, because often in Parliament we have this sense of complacency.
Can I ask the member for Islington North to bring his his speech to a conclusion, please? Thank you.
Of course, I apologise, Madam Chair. I wasn't aware there was a time limit on it. So I'll very, very briefly just say this, that in our complacency, let's not forget brave people that have blown the whistle on the truth around the world. And I'm thinking here of Julian Assange for the work that he has done in exposing what has happened around the world in preparation for war and other things. In some countries around the world, he would be called a hero for being a whistleblower. Here, he's called something very, very different. We should think of what news values and values of the freedom of speech are actually all about. I thank you, Madam Chairman, for giving me the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you. I now go to